Portugal, 1755. Part 1. The Unsettling Morning. The sun had just begun to rise over the horizon, its golden rays gently illuminating the narrow, cobblestone streets of the small fishing village on the outskirts of Lisbon. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying with it the scent of salt from the nearby ocean, mingling with the earthy aroma of the early morning dew that clung to the rooftops and windowsills of the humble cottages. It was the day of All Saints, a day of reflection and reverence, and the village was slowly stirring to life, its inhabitants beginning their daily routines with a sense of quiet purpose. Isabel, a young woman of 20, awoke with a start. The previous night's dreams had been strange, unsettling, filled with fragmented images that she couldn't quite piece together. As she lay in bed, the remnants of those dreams clung to her consciousness like a thick fog, refusing to dissipate even as she blinked her eyes open to the new day. There was an unusual heaviness in her chest, a persistent feeling that something was amiss, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. She had always been sensitive to the subtle shifts in the world around her, and today, more than ever, she felt an inexplicable tension in the air. The room around her was small and modest, its walls adorned with simple wooden crosses and a few hand-woven tapestries that added warmth to the otherwise plain space. The light filtering through the small window was soft, casting delicate shadows on the floor. Isabel's bed, a simple wooden frame with a thin mattress, creaked as she swung her legs over the side and stood up. Her long, dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, still tousled from sleep, as she reached for the basin of water on the nightstand and splashed her face, hoping to wash away the lingering unease. Despite the quietude of the morning, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that today was different, that something beyond the ordinary was about to unfold. She dressed quickly, choosing a simple gown of faded blue linen, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders to ward off the chill that still lingered in the air. As she moved about the room, her movements were deliberate, as if she were trying to ground herself in the familiar routine of her morning, but the sense of foreboding persisted. The small cottage she shared with her father and brothers was already filled with the comforting sounds of a household coming to life. The crackling of the fire in the hearth, the clatter of pots and pans as her father prepared breakfast, the low murmur of her brothers' voices as they discussed the day's work. All these sounds were usually a source of comfort to Isabel, but today they felt distant, almost muffled, as if a barrier separated her from the world she had always known. Isabel's father, João, was a weathered man in his late 40s, his face etched with the lines of a life spent at sea. His hands, calloused and strong, moved deftly as he prepared the morning meal. Simple fare of bread, cheese, and salted fish. He had been a fisherman for as long as Isabel could remember, rising before dawn each day to take his boat out to the ocean, braving the elements to provide for his family. Despite the hardships, João had always been a steady presence in Isabel's life, a pillar of strength and resilience. This morning, however, even João seemed to sense that something was not quite right. As Isabel entered the small kitchen, she caught him glancing out the window, his brow furrowed in thought. He looked up as she approached, his expression softening as he saw her, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "Isabel," he greeted her, his voice low and roughened by years of shouting orders over the roar of the ocean. "You're up early." Isabel nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, her voice tinged with the unease she couldn't shake. "I've been feeling strange, like something's going to happen." João's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if he were weighing her words, trying to discern the source of her unease. He had always respected Isabel's intuition, though he rarely spoke of it. In a world governed by the unpredictability of the sea, he had learned to trust the subtle signs that others might overlook. "Perhaps it's just the day," he said finally, trying to reassure her. "It's All Saints' Day, a time for reflection. Maybe your heart is telling you to spend some time in prayer." Isabel considered his words, knowing there was truth in them. She had been neglecting her spiritual practices lately, caught up in the demands of helping her family with the fishing business. The sea had a way of consuming one's life, its endless cycles of tides and storms dictating the rhythms of their days. But today, something deep within her was urging her to step away from the familiar, to seek solace in the sanctuary of the church. "I think you're right, Father," she replied softly. "I'll go to the church this morning before we head out to sea." João nodded, his eyes briefly flicking back to the window as if searching for answers in the distant horizon. "Do what you feel is right, Isabel. But don't be too long. We'll need all hands on deck today." With a quiet nod, Isabel turned and made her way to the door, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. As she stepped outside, the cool morning air embraced her, and she paused for a moment to take in the scene before her. The village was coming alive, the early risers going about their business, their faces a mixture of solemnity and quiet determination as they prepared for the day's work. The distant sound of the waves crashing against the shore was a constant reminder of the sea's presence, both a provider and a threat. Isabel's path to the church took her through the heart of the village, past the familiar sights and sounds of a place that had always been her home. She passed the market stalls where vendors were setting up their goods, the bakery where the smell of fresh bread wafted into the street, and the small shops where the villagers would gather to gossip and exchange news. Normally, Isabel would have stopped to chat with the shopkeepers, to inquire about their families and share a laugh or two. But today, she felt a sense of urgency that pushed her forward, her steps quickening as she neared the church. The church itself was a simple stone structure, its facade weathered by time and the elements, yet it stood with a quiet dignity that spoke of its importance to the community. The heavy wooden doors were already open, inviting the faithful to enter and seek refuge within its sacred walls. Isabel hesitated for a moment at the entrance, her hand resting on the cool stone as she took a deep breath. The feeling of unease that had followed her all morning seemed to intensify as she crossed the threshold, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, the church was dimly lit, the only light coming from the candles that flickered softly on the altar and along the rows of pews. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a comforting fragrance that filled the space with a sense of reverence and peace. A few worshippers were already seated, their heads bowed in prayer, their murmurs barely audible in the stillness of the room. Isabel found a seat near the front, her usual spot when she attended Mass. She knelt, bowing her head as she tried to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. She had come here seeking clarity, but now that she was here, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. It was as if something was pulling at her, urging her to be vigilant, to be prepared for whatever was to come. As the priest began the Mass, Isabel struggled to focus on the familiar words and rituals. Her mind kept drifting to the sea, to the memories of her family's daily routine, to the strange dreams that had haunted her sleep. She had always found comfort in the church, in the sense of community and faith that it provided. But today, that comfort seemed elusive, just out of reach. Isabel's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, almost imperceptible tremor beneath her feet. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the ground beneath her seemed to shift, just slightly. She glanced around the church, but the other worshippers appeared not to notice, their heads still bowed in prayer. Had she imagined it? Was it just her nerves playing tricks on her? But as she tried to shake off the feeling, another tremor rippled through the ground, stronger this time. The candles on the altar flickered, their flames wavering as the tremor passed through the church like a shiver down its spine. Isabel's heart raced as she looked to the priest, who had paused mid-sentence, his eyes wide with alarm. The tremor subsided, leaving a tense silence in its wake. The worshippers exchanged uneasy glances, whispers of confusion and fear beginning to spread through the pews. Isabel's hands gripped the edge of the pew in front of her, her knuckles white with tension. She knew now that something was very, very wrong. And then it happened. The ground beneath Lisbon roared to life with a force that shook the very foundations of the city. The church, once a sanctuary of peace, was transformed into a place of terror as the stone walls began to shudder violently, the sound of cracking wood and splitting stone filling the air. The tremors that had been mere whispers were now deafening, a cacophony of destruction that reverberated through the church like the wrath of a vengeful god. Isabel's breath caught in her throat as she watched in horror as the grand stained-glass windows, once so beautiful in their depiction of the saints, shattered into 1,000 pieces, the shards raining down like deadly confetti. The pews around her began to shift and splinter, the floor beneath her feet buckling and cracking as if it were alive. The priest, once a figure of calm authority, was now struggling to keep his balance, his voice lost in the chaos. In the midst of the destruction, Isabel felt a strange sense of clarity, as if time had slowed down just enough for her to grasp what was happening. This was no ordinary earthquake. This was a disaster of biblical proportions, a catastrophe that would change the course of history. And she was at the very center of it. Through the dust and debris, Isabel's eyes were drawn to the entrance of the church, where a figure stood, bathed in a soft, ethereal light. He was tall and composed, untouched by the chaos that surrounded him. His presence was commanding yet gentle, his expression one of calm assurance. In the midst of the apocalypse unfolding around her, Isabel felt an inexplicable pull toward him, as if he were the eye of the storm, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He raised his hand, beckoning her to come to him, and without a second thought, Isabel obeyed. She rose from her knees, her movements fluid and purposeful as she made her way toward him, her gaze locked on his. The church continued to collapse around her, but she was no longer afraid. The figure's presence filled her with a sense of peace, as if everything was happening exactly as it was meant to. As Isabel reached the figure, the final tremors shook the church to its core. The roof gave way with a deafening crash, the stone columns crumbling under the weight. But before she could be engulfed by the destruction, the figure took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring, and together they moved through the chaos as if it were nothing more than a passing storm. The heavy wooden doors of the church were flung open by the force of the earthquake, and the figure led Isabel outside into the open air. The world beyond the church was no less terrifying. Buildings crumbled, the ground split open, and the sky darkened with smoke and ash. The once vibrant city of Lisbon was being reduced to rubble before her very eyes. But Isabel had no time to dwell on the destruction. The figure, still holding her hand, guided her up a narrow street, away from the devastation, away from the collapsing buildings and the screams of those caught in the chaos. They climbed higher and higher, the figure's pace steady and unrelenting, until they reached a hill that overlooked the city and the sea beyond. Breathless and overwhelmed, Isabel turned to look back at the church, now a pile of rubble in the distance. The man of light stood beside her, his presence a reminder that even in the midst of destruction, there was still hope, still a purpose to be fulfilled. She didn't know who he was or why he had chosen her, but in that moment, she knew that her life was no longer her own. It was in the hands of something far greater, something that she could only begin to understand. As she stood there, watching the city she loved crumble into dust, Isabel felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The figure's presence was like a balm to her soul, soothing the fear and uncertainty that had gripped her heart. She knew that whatever was to come, she was not alone. The man of light had come for her, had guided her to safety, and now it was up to her to fulfill the mission he had set before her. Part 2. The Earthquake. The moment Isabel stepped outside the crumbling church, she was met with the full force of the earthquake's wrath. The world around her was a nightmare of destruction. The ground heaved and bucked beneath her feet, sending waves of motion rippling through the earth like an angry ocean. The once solid cobblestone streets of Lisbon cracked and split open, yawning chasms appearing where moments before there had been only solid ground. The noise was deafening, an overwhelming cacophony of collapsing buildings, shattering glass, and the panicked cries of those caught in the midst of the chaos. The air was thick with dust and smoke, obscuring the sky and casting a pall over the city that had once gleamed in the morning sun. Isabel felt the force of the tremors deep in her bones, a physical manifestation of the fear and helplessness that gripped her heart. Yet amidst the turmoil, Isabel's mind remained strangely clear. The figure of light who had guided her out of the church was still with her, his presence a steadying force that kept her grounded even as the world seemed to be falling apart. His face was serene, untouched by the fear and panic that gripped the people around them. It was as if he were an anchor, holding her steady in the storm. He led her away from the immediate destruction, his pace calm and deliberate. Isabel followed without hesitation, her trust in him absolute. They moved through the streets with purpose, dodging falling debris and navigating around gaping holes in the ground. Each step they took seemed guided, as if they were following a path that only the man of light could see. The destruction was immense. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled as if made of sand, their stone facades collapsing in on themselves with a sickening roar. The grand houses of the wealthy, the humble homes of the poor, the bustling shops and markets, all were reduced to ruins in a matter of minutes. The earth itself seemed to be tearing the city apart, as if some great, unseen force was exacting vengeance upon Lisbon. Isabel's heart ached as she witnessed the devastation. She had grown up in these streets, had walked these paths every day of her life. To see them now, broken and shattered, was almost more than she could bear. She thought of her family, her father and brothers, out at sea, praying that they were safe, that they had somehow been spared the horrors unfolding on land. As they moved through the city, the man of light guided Isabel to the higher ground. The tremors were less severe here, but the devastation was no less apparent. They passed by what had once been the city's grand cathedral, its towering spires now reduced to rubble, the sacred space within exposed to the sky. Isabel's heart twisted at the sight. This was the very heart of Lisbon's faith, now laid bare and broken. The man of light paused for a moment, turning to look at Isabel with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. "There is more to come," he said, his voice carrying both a warning and a promise. "But you must be strong, Isabel. There is still a great task ahead of you." Isabel nodded, though her heart was heavy with dread. She could feel the earth's anger beneath her feet, could sense that the worst was not yet over. The man of light continued to guide her, leading her to a vantage point overlooking the city. From here, they could see the full extent of the destruction, the collapsed buildings, the smoke rising from fires that had broken out, the shattered streets. But it wasn't just the city that held Isabel's attention. Her eyes were drawn to the ocean, visible in the distance. The water, usually so calm and reassuring, was behaving strangely. It was pulling back from the shore, retreating with unnatural speed, exposing the seabed and leaving boats stranded on the wet sand. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. She knew what this meant. "The sea," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "It's going to come back." The man of light nodded solemnly. "Yes, Isabel, a great wave is coming, and when it does, it will bring further devastation. But there is still time to save lives. You must act now." Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the gravity of the situation. The earthquake had been only the beginning, a precursor to something even more catastrophic. The sea, which had been a source of life and sustenance for her and her family, was now a harbinger of death. Without another word, Isabel turned and ran back down the hill, the urgency of the situation propelling her forward. The tremors were still ongoing, making every step treacherous, but she pushed forward, determined to warn as many people as possible before the tsunami hit. As she reached the streets below, Isabel shouted at the top of her lungs, her voice filled with the urgency of the message she needed to convey. Run! Run to the hills. The sea is coming. There's going to be a great wave. You must flee now. The people around her, dazed and disoriented from the earthquake, stared at her in confusion. Some were too shocked to move, while others seemed unable to comprehend the danger they were in. But Isabel did not give up. She moved from street to street, her voice growing hoarse as she repeated her warning, urging anyone who would listen to flee to higher ground. Slowly, her words began to sink in. The first few people started to move, then more, until finally a wave of panic spread through the crowd, spurring them into action. Isabel's heart pounded as she watched the villagers run toward the hills, their fear driving them to safety. But there were still so many more who hadn't heard her, who were still too shocked or confused to react. Isabel didn't stop. She kept moving, kept shouting, her voice echoing through the narrow streets. She could feel the ground beneath her feet trembling, as if the earth itself was warning her to hurry. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the acrid smell of burning would filling her nostrils. The city was falling apart around her, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep going, had to save as many lives as she could. Finally, she reached the edge of the city, where the land began to slope upward toward the hills. Here, she saw groups of people already climbing to safety, their faces pale with fear, but driven by the instinct to survive. Isabel's heart surged with relief. Some had listened, some had understood the danger and acted in time. But as she turned to look back at the city, a sound reached her ears that made her blood run cold. It was a distant roar, low and deep, like the growl of some great, terrible beast. The sound grew louder with each passing second, a warning of the impending disaster. Isabel's eyes widened as she saw it. A massive wall of water, taller than any building in Lisbon, rushing toward the city with terrifying speed. The tsunami, unleashed by the same forces that had caused the earthquake, was bearing down on the city, ready to consume everything in its path. The wave hit the shore with a force that defied comprehension. The ground shook as the water surged inland, sweeping away everything in its path: houses, boats, trees, and people. The sound of the wave crashing into the city was a deafening roar, drowning out the cries of those caught in its path. Isabel could only watch in horror as the wave consumed Lisbon, the water rising higher and higher, covering the city in a matter of moments. The devastation was beyond anything Isabel had imagined. The city she had known all her life was gone, swallowed by the sea. The streets, the buildings, the familiar landmarks, all of it was now underwater, reduced to debris floating in the churning waves. But even in the face of this unimaginable horror, Isabel knew that she had done all she could. She had saved lives and had warned as many people as possible before the wave hit. The man of light had given her a task, and she had fulfilled it to the best of her ability. As she stood on the hill, watching the sea reclaim the city, Isabel felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see the man of light standing beside her, his expression calm and resolute. He looked out at the water with a sense of understanding, as if he had seen such devastation before, and knew that it was part of a greater plan. "You did well, Isabel," he said softly. "You saved many today. Your courage and faith have made a difference." Tears filled Isabel's eyes as she looked back at the city, now a desolate wasteland. She felt a deep sorrow for those who had been lost, for the city that had been her home. But she also felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had done everything in her power to save as many as possible. As the man of light spoke, Isabel turned back to thank him, but to her surprise, he was gone. He had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving her alone on the hilltop, the roar of the ocean still echoing in her ears. Isabel stood there for a long time, watching as the waves began to recede, the waters slowly pulling back toward the sea. The city was in ruins, but those who had survived would rebuild, and would find a way to carry on. And Isabel would be there to help them, to lead them through the dark days ahead, just as the man of light had led her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she would face it with the same courage and faith that had guided her through this day. The disaster had changed her, had shown her the strength she never knew she had. And as she looked out at the city, she knew that she would use that strength to rebuild, to help others, to honor the lives that had been lost. With a final glance at the sea, Isabel turned and began to walk back toward the survivors, ready to face whatever came next. The world had changed, but so had she, and she knew that, no matter what happened, she would continue to walk the path that had been set before her, guided by the light of faith and the memory of the man who had saved her. Part 3. The Tsunami. The devastation wrought by the earthquake had left Lisbon in ruins, but the true horror had only just begun. From her vantage point on the hill, Isabel could see the city below, or what remained of it. The streets were strewn with debris, the buildings that had once stood tall now reduced to shattered remnants of stone and timber. The cries of the wounded and the grieving echoed up to where she stood, a haunting chorus that filled the air with sorrow and despair. But it was not just the destruction of the city that held Isabel's attention. Her eyes were drawn to the ocean, where something far more ominous was unfolding. The sea, usually so constant and familiar, was behaving in a way that defied all reason. The water was receding from the shore at an alarming rate, pulling back like a curtain to reveal the sandy seabed beneath. Boats that had been anchored near the docks were now stranded on the exposed sand, their hulls tilting awkwardly as they were left high and dry. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the water retreating further and further from the coast. She knew enough about the sea to understand what was coming next. The old fishermen in the village had spoken of it, had shared tales of the ocean's wrath when it pulled back only to return with deadly force. The term they used was tsunami, though Isabel had never seen one with her own eyes. Now, standing on the hilltop with the man of light by her side, Isabel realized with a cold dread that she was about to witness one of the most terrifying forces of nature, a wall of water that would sweep through the city, consuming everything in its path. There was no stopping it, no way to prevent the destruction that was about to be unleashed. Isabel turned to the man of light, her voice trembling with fear. "The sea, it's going to come back, isn't it?" The man nodded, his expression grave. "Yes, Isabel, the wave is coming, and when it does, it will bring devastation unlike anything you have seen. But you still have a chance to save lives. You must warn the people, help them to higher ground before it's too late." Isabel felt a surge of panic rising within her. The thought of the wave crashing into the city, sweeping away the survivors who had already endured so much, was almost too much to bear. But the man of light's presence gave her strength, his calm assurance steadying her nerves. She knew that she could not allow herself to be paralyzed by fear. She had been given a task, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. Without another word, Isabel turned and ran down the hill, her legs moving with a speed she hadn't known she was capable of. The ground beneath her feet still trembled with the aftershocks of the earthquake, making every step a precarious gamble, but she pushed forward with a single-minded determination. The destruction that lay in her path was daunting. Fallen trees, crumbled walls, and gaping chasms that had opened in the earth. But she navigated them with a grace that was almost otherworldly, as if guided by an unseen hand. As she reached the outskirts of the city, the first tremors of panic began to spread among the people. Some had noticed the sea pulling back, their instincts telling them that something was terribly wrong. Others were still dazed from the earthquake, their minds struggling to process the events of the last few minutes. Isabel could see the fear in their eyes, the desperation as they looked for answers, for someone to tell them what to do. Isabel didn't hesitate. She began shouting, her voice carrying through the chaos. "Run! Run to the hills! The sea is coming back. There's going to be a great wave. You must get to higher ground now." Her words cut through the confusion, jolting people into action. Those who heard her began to move, some slowly at first, then faster as the reality of the situation sank in. Isabel's heart raced as she watched them flee toward the hills, their faces pale with fear. But there were still so many more who hadn't heard her, who were still frozen in place, unable to comprehend the danger they were in. Isabel continued to run through the streets, her voice growing hoarse as she repeated her warnings. The ground beneath her feet was unsteady, the aftershocks of the earthquake still rippling through the city. But she couldn't stop, not when so many lives were at stake. She pushed herself to the limit, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she sprinted from street to street, shouting for anyone who would listen to flee. As she reached the lower part of the city, closer to the docks, Isabel saw the water begin to return. It started as a distant roar, a low rumble that grew louder with each passing second. The sound was terrifying, a deep, primal force that seemed to shake the very air around her. Isabel turned to look at the horizon, and her blood ran cold at the sight that met her eyes. The wave was enormous, a wall of water taller than any building in Lisbon, moving with a speed and power that defied comprehension. It was as if the ocean itself had risen up in anger, ready to sweep away everything in its path. The sight of it was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a reminder of nature's unmatched fury. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that time was running out. The wave was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But she could still save lives. She could still warn those who were close enough to escape. She ran toward the docks, where a group of fishermen were trying to salvage what they could from their boats. Isabel shouted at them, her voice desperate. "Leave the boats! Run to the hills! The wave is coming! You don't have much time!" The men looked up, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. But when they saw the wave bearing down on them, their hesitation vanished. They dropped everything and ran, their feet pounding the ground as they sprinted toward higher ground. Isabel continued to shout, continued to warn anyone she could see. But the wave was faster than she was. It surged through the city with terrifying speed, crashing into the docks with a force that sent water and debris flying into the air. Isabel was thrown off her feet by the impact, the force of the wave knocking her to the ground. She gasped as the cold water engulfed her, pulling her into its relentless current. For a moment, everything was chaos. The water swirled around her, churning with debris and the remnants of the city. Isabel struggled to stay afloat, her lungs burning as she fought to keep her head above the surface. She was tossed and tumbled by the wave, her body battered by the force of the water. She could hear the screams of those caught in the wave, the sounds of destruction as the water tore through the city. But even in the midst of the chaos, Isabel's mind remained clear. She had to survive. She had to keep fighting. The man of light had guided her, had given her a mission, and she couldn't give up now. With a surge of determination, Isabel kicked her legs, pushing herself toward a piece of floating debris. She grabbed hold of it, her fingers gripping the rough wood as she fought to keep herself above the water. The wave continued to surge through the city, sweeping away everything in its path. Isabel clung to the debris, her body shivering from the cold and the fear. She didn't know how long she would have to endure, didn't know if she would survive, but she refused to give up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the water began to recede. The wave pulled back, leaving behind a city in ruins. Isabel coughed and gasped for air as she was left stranded on the wet ground, her body battered and bruised but alive. She looked around at the devastation, at the streets filled with debris and the buildings that had been reduced to rubble. The city she had known was gone, swallowed by the sea. But even in the face of such overwhelming destruction, Isabel knew that she had done everything she could. She had saved lives and had warned as many people as possible before the wave hit. The man of light had given her a mission, and she had fulfilled it to the best of her ability. As Isabel lay on the ground, her body aching and her heart heavy with grief, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up to see the man of light standing beside her, his expression calm and resolute. He looked out at the city with a sense of understanding, as if he had seen such devastation before and knew that it was part of a greater plan. "You did well, Isabel," he said softly. "You saved many today. Your courage and faith have made a difference." Tears filled Isabel's eyes as she looked back at the city, now a desolate wasteland. She felt a deep sorrow for those who had been lost, for the city that had been her home. But she also felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had done everything in her power to save as many as possible. As the man of light spoke, Isabel turned back to thank him, but to her surprise, he was gone. He had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving her alone on the soaked, debris-strewn ground. The roar of the ocean still echoed in her ears, but now there was a strange calmness in the air, as if the worst had passed and the world was holding its breath. Isabel sat there for a long time, the weight of everything she had witnessed pressing down on her. The world around her had changed forever, and so had she. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be unimaginable challenges as the survivors struggled to rebuild their lives. But she also knew that she would face those challenges with the same courage and faith that had guided her through the day. With a final glance at the ocean, now receding back to its normal boundaries, Isabel slowly rose to her feet. She was exhausted, her body aching from the ordeal, but she knew she couldn't rest yet. There were still people to help, still lives to save. As she began to walk back toward the survivors, Isabel felt a sense of resolve harden within her. She had been tested in the crucible of disaster, had faced the worst that nature could throw at her, and had come out stronger for it. The city may have been in ruins, but its spirit was not broken, and neither was hers. She would continue to walk the path that had been set before her, guided by the light of faith and the memory of the man who had saved her. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Part 4. The Aftermath. The sun had begun its descent by the time the chaos of the tsunami subsided, casting a muted, orange glow over what remained of Lisbon. The once vibrant city was now a ghostly silhouette of broken structures and shattered lives. Smoke curled upward from the smoldering ruins, mingling with the dust that hung heavy in the air, creating a hazy shroud over the devastated landscape. The only sounds that remained were the distant cries of the wounded and the eerie creaking of buildings on the verge of collapse. Isabel stood at the edge of what had once been a bustling marketplace, now an expanse of debris and destruction. The wooden stalls where merchants once hawked their wares were reduced to splinters, and the cobblestone streets were buried under a thick layer of mud and rubble. The vibrant colors of the market, the smells of fresh produce and spices, the lively chatter of traders, everything had been swept away by the relentless force of nature, leaving only silence in its wake. As Isabel surveyed the scene, a deep sorrow settled in her chest. The weight of the day's events pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. She had seen so much loss, so much pain, and yet she knew that she couldn't allow herself to be consumed by it. There was still work to be done, still lives to save, still people who needed her help. The streets were filled with survivors, those who had managed to escape the worst of the disaster, but were now faced with the daunting task of finding food, water, and shelter. Many of them were injured, their clothes torn and their faces streaked with blood and dirt. They wandered through the ruins in a daze, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Some called out for loved ones, their voices cracking with desperation, while others simply sat in silence, too overwhelmed to move. Isabel knew that she couldn't help everyone, but she was determined to do what she could. She approached a group of women huddled together near the remnants of a collapsed building. Their faces were etched with fear and exhaustion, and they clutched their children tightly, as if holding on to the only thing that still made sense in the world. "Are you hurt?" Isabel asked gently, kneeling beside them. One of the women, an older lady with gray hair matted with dust, shook her head. No, but we don't know where to go. We've lost everything. Isabel nodded, her heart aching for them. There's a makeshift camp being set up on the hill just beyond the city, she said, pointing in the direction from which she had come. It's not much, but it's safe, and there are others there who can help. The women exchanged uncertain glances, but Isabel's calm demeanor seemed to reassure them. Slowly, they began to gather their things, what little they had managed to salvage, and started toward the hill. Isabel watched them go, a small sense of relief washing over her. At least they were out of immediate danger. As the women disappeared into the distance, Isabel turned her attention to the other survivors. She spotted a young boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, sitting alone on a pile of rubble, his face streaked with tears. His clothes were soaked and torn, and he was shivering, despite the warmth of the fading sunlight. Isabel's heart broke at the sight. She hurried over to him, kneeling down so that she was at eye level with the child. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly, reaching out to gently touch his arm. "Are you all right?" The boy looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. I can't find my mama," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Isabel swallowed the lump that had formed in her throat. "We'll find her, I promise," she said, her voice steady even as her heart ached. "But first, let's get you somewhere safe, okay?" The boy nodded, sniffling as he wiped his nose with the back of his hand. Isabel carefully helped him to his feet, her hand never leaving his, and began to lead him toward the hill where the makeshift camp was being set up. As they walked, she kept her eyes peeled for any sign of the boy's mother, calling out her name whenever she saw a group of survivors. The journey was slow, each step a painful reminder of the devastation that had befallen the city. They passed by what had once been a row of beautiful townhouses, now reduced to rubble and twisted metal. The streets were strewn with broken furniture, shattered glass, and the remnants of lives that had been torn apart in an instant. As they reached the camp, Isabel felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The day's events had taken their toll, and her body ached with fatigue. But there was no time to rest, not when there were still so many in need. She guided the boy to a group of women who were tending to the injured, making sure that he was in good hands before continuing her search for other survivors. The camp was a chaotic but determined effort to bring some semblance of order to the chaos. Makeshift tents had been erected using whatever materials were available: sheets of fabric, broken doors, pieces of wood, and fires had been lit to provide warmth as the evening chill set in. The smell of smoke and ash hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the destruction that surrounded them. Despite the overwhelming sense of loss, there was also a palpable sense of resilience among the survivors. They had been through hell, but they were still standing, still fighting to survive. Isabel could see it in their eyes, the determination to rebuild, to move forward, no matter how daunting the task ahead. As she moved through the camp, Isabel came across a group of men who were organizing a search party to look for survivors still trapped under the rubble. She immediately volunteered to join them, her exhaustion forgotten in the face of the need to help. Together, they made their way back into the city, their eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of life. The search was slow and painstaking, the debris heavy and difficult to move. But they worked tirelessly, driven by the hope that they might find someone alive. Hours passed, the sun dipping lower in the sky, but they didn't stop. Every now and then, they would hear a faint cry for help, a small voice calling out from beneath the rubble, and they would dig with renewed vigor, their hearts pounding with the possibility of a rescue. Finally, as night began to fall, they heard it, a weak, muffled voice calling out from beneath the collapsed building. Isabel's heart leapt in her chest as she and the others rushed to the spot, their hands working frantically to clear away the debris. The voice grew louder, more desperate, and they worked faster, their breath coming in short, sharp gasps as they pushed their bodies to the limit. And then, finally, they saw her, a young woman, her face pale and bruised, but alive. She was trapped under a heavy beam, her legs pinned beneath the rubble. Isabel's hands shook with relief as they carefully freed her, lifting the beam and pulling her out from the wreckage. The woman gasped for air as she was finally released, her body trembling with shock and exhaustion. Isabel knelt beside her, her hand gently brushing the woman's hair away from her face. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We've got you." The woman looked up at Isabel, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for saving me." Isabel smiled, though her heart was heavy with the knowledge that there were still so many others who had not been as lucky. She helped the woman to her feet, supporting her as they made their way back to the camp. The night had fallen fully now, the stars twinkling faintly in the dark sky, but the fires of the camp provided a warm, welcoming glow as they approached. The camp was a stark contrast to the city they had left behind, a place of hope amidst the ruins, where survivors gathered to find comfort and solace in each other's company. As Isabel and the woman entered the camp, they were met with soft murmurs of relief and gratitude from the others. It was a small victory in the midst of so much loss, but it was a victory nonetheless. Isabel helped the woman to a tent where she could rest and receive medical attention. As she did, she couldn't help but think of the man of light, the one who had guided her through the day's events. She had no doubt that he had been an angel sent to help her in her time of need. And though he was gone now, his presence still lingered in her heart, a reminder of the strength and courage that had carried her through the darkest hours. As the night wore on, Isabel continued to move through the camp, offering comfort and assistance wherever she could. The survivors huddled together for warmth, sharing stories of their loved ones and their hopes for the future. Despite the overwhelming sense of loss, there was also a sense of unity, a shared determination to rebuild their lives from the ashes. Isabel knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that they would find a way to carry on. They had survived the worst that nature could throw at them, and now they would survive the aftermath. They would rebuild their city, their lives, and their spirits, and they would do it together, with faith and resilience as their guiding lights. As she finally allowed herself to rest, Isabel looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brightly above the ruins of Lisbon. She knew that the journey was far from over, but she also knew that she was not alone. The man of light had shown her the way, and now she would continue to walk that path, guided by the hope and faith that had carried her through the darkest day of her life. And with that thought, Isabel closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day finally overtake her. The camp around her was quiet, the fires burning low, but she knew that when the sun rose again, they would face the new day with courage and determination. They would rebuild, they would heal, and they would honor the memory of those who had been lost. Isabel drifted off to sleep, her heart filled with a quiet resolve. The city may have been in ruins, but its spirit was not broken, and neither was hers. Part 5. A Legacy of Faith. Years passed, and Lisbon, once a city in ruins, slowly but surely began to rise from the ashes. The process of rebuilding was long and arduous, marked by countless challenges, but it was driven by the indomitable spirit of its people. The scars of the disaster remained, both in the landscape and in the hearts of those who had survived, but they were a testament to the resilience and strength that had carried the city through its darkest hour. The new Lisbon that emerged was different from the city that had been destroyed. The buildings were sturdier, constructed with the lessons learned from the earthquake and tsunami in mind. The streets were wider, the infrastructure more modern, and the people, though forever changed, were more united than ever before. The city had been reborn, not just in a physical sense, but in its very soul. Isabel had become a respected figure in the community, known not just for her bravery during the disaster, but for her tireless efforts in the years that followed. She had dedicated herself to helping others, founding an orphanage for the children who had lost their families and organizing efforts to rebuild homes and businesses. Her work was a beacon of hope for those who had lost so much, and she became a symbol of the city's resilience. The orphanage, a modest but well-maintained building on the outskirts of the city, was a place of warmth and safety for the children who had nowhere else to go. Isabel had poured her heart into creating a home for them, ensuring that they had not only food and shelter, but also love and guidance. She knew that these children were the future of Lisbon, and she wanted to give them the best chance at a happy, fulfilling life. The orphanage was surrounded by a garden, where the children played and tended to the plants, learning the value of hard work and nurturing life. It was a place of healing, not just for the children, but for Isabel herself. The garden had become her sanctuary, a place where she could reflect on the past and find peace in the simple, everyday tasks of planting, watering, and harvesting. The flowers that bloomed there were a testament to the beauty that could grow even in the aftermath of destruction. Isabel's days were filled with the busy work of running the orphanage and continuing her efforts to rebuild the city. She had become a trusted advisor to the local leaders, her insight and experience invaluable in guiding the city's recovery. Her voice was one of reason and compassion, always advocating for the needs of the most vulnerable. Under her guidance, Lisbon had not only rebuilt its physical structures, but had also healed its social fabric, creating a stronger, more equitable community. But even as Isabel dedicated herself to the work of rebuilding, she never forgot the man of light who had guided her on that fateful day. His presence had been a turning point in her life, a moment of divine intervention that had set her on the path she now walked. Though she had never seen him again, she felt his influence in everything she did, as if he were still watching over her, guiding her steps. Every year on the anniversary of the disaster, Isabel would visit the site where the church had once stood. The new church, rebuilt on the same spot, was a grand structure, its stone walls and stained glass windows a symbol of the city's rebirth. But Isabel's visits were always solemn, a time for reflection and prayer. She would lay flowers at the base of the altar, the same spot where she had first encountered the man of light, and she would spend hours in quiet meditation, remembering the lives that had been lost and giving thanks for the strength that had carried her through. The years passed, and Lisbon continued to grow and thrive. The city that had once been a symbol of destruction was now a beacon of hope and resilience, admired by all who visited. The people of Lisbon had not just rebuilt their city, they had transformed it into a place of beauty, innovation, and compassion. The lessons of the disaster had been hard-learned, but they had created a community that was stronger, more united, and more committed to ensuring that such a tragedy would never happen again. Isabel's legacy lived on in the lives she had touched, in the orphanage she had founded, and in the hearts of those who remembered her story. She had become a beloved figure in Lisbon, her name spoken with reverence and gratitude by those who had been inspired by her courage and faith. The orphanage continued to flourish, the children growing into strong, compassionate adults who carried Isabel's teachings with them into the world. As Isabel grew older, she began to step back from the day-to-day operations of the orphanage, entrusting it to a new generation of caretakers who shared her vision and dedication. She spent more time in the garden, tending to the plants that had become a metaphor for her life's work, nurturing, growing, and flourishing even in the face of adversity. On the last anniversary of the disaster that Isabel would see, she made her way to the church once more. The years had taken their toll on her body, but her spirit remained as strong as ever. She walked slowly, her steps deliberate, but there was a peacefulness in her movements, a quiet acceptance of the passage of time. As she entered the church, the familiar scent of incense filled her senses, and she felt a wave of calm wash over her. The church was empty, the only sound the soft echo of her footsteps on the stone floor. Isabel made her way to the altar, where she knelt and bowed her head in prayer. She prayed for the souls of those who had been lost, for the city that had been reborn, and for the man of light who had saved her life. As she prayed, she felt a warmth envelop her, a sensation she had not felt in many years. It was the same feeling she had experienced on that fateful day, the presence of the man of light, watching over her, guiding her. Isabel smiled, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She knew that her journey was coming to an end, but she also knew that she had fulfilled the purpose that had been set before her. When she left the church that day, Isabel knew that she would not return, but she also knew that her legacy would live on, in the lives of the children she had cared for, in the city she had helped to rebuild, and in the hearts of those who had been inspired by her story. Lisbon would continue to grow and thrive, a testament to the resilience of its people and the power of faith. And as Isabel walked back to the orphanage, her heart was filled with peace. She had lived a life of purpose, guided by the light of faith and the memory of a man who had shown her the way. And as the sun set over the city she loved, Isabel knew that she was ready for whatever lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that she had done all she could to make the world a better place. The city of Lisbon, once shattered by disaster, now stood as a beacon of hope and resilience, a place where the lessons of the past had forged a brighter, more compassionate future. And at the heart of it all was the legacy of a woman whose courage and faith had saved countless lives, and whose memory would continue to inspire generations to come. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.